I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, but life has a strange way of unraveling, doesn't it? My name is Rachel, and this is the story of how I caught my mother in the act, and how everything spiraled out of control after that. It all began on a warm Sunday afternoon. My parents had been married for almost 30 years, and while they weren't the most romantic couple, I always believed they were happy. My father was a quiet man, more focused on his work than his emotions, and my mother, well, she was the kind of woman who thrived on attention. But never did I imagine that her need for attention would lead to something like this. John had been around our family for as long as I could remember. He was my father's best friend, a charming, charismatic man who seemed to have it all together. He was always there for my dad, always the guy to give advice, help fix things, or be a shoulder to lean on. I had grown up seeing him as a part of the family, but things started to change when I noticed how often John came over, even when my father wasn't around. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was like an uncle to me, and I assumed he was just helping my mom with errands or offering support while Dad was away on business. But there was something in the air that didn't sit right with me. The way they laughed at each other's jokes a little too hard. The way my mother's eyes lit up when John walked into the room. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself I was imagining things. After all, it was John, my father's best friend. There was no way anything inappropriate could be happening, right? One afternoon, everything changed. I had come home earlier than expected from work. I remember feeling uneasy as I walked through the front door, an odd tension lingering in the air. My mom hadn't mentioned John coming over that day, but as soon as I heard voices from the kitchen, my stomach dropped. Something wasn't right. As I crept down the hallway, their hushed whispers grew louder. My heart raced, and I was torn between turning around and leaving or confronting what I feared. The moment I turned the corner and saw them standing far too close to each other, my mother's hand gently brushing John's arm, I froze. It wasn't an intimate act, but it was enough. Enough to make my blood boil. Enough to confirm the worst thoughts that had been swirling in my head for weeks. They hadn't seen me yet. I stood there, hidden in the shadows, watching as their conversation grew more intense. John leaned in closer, his hand resting on the small of my mother's back. Her face was flushed, her breathing quick, and for a split second, I thought they might... No, I couldn't watch anymore. "Mom?" My voice cracked, and they both jumped back like they had been burned. The guilt on my mother's face was undeniable. She stammered something incoherent, backing away from John as if that could erase what had just happened. John, too, looked horrified, but there was something else in his eyes. A flicker of defiance, maybe. As if he wasn't sorry at all. "Rachel, it's not what it looks like," my mom blurted out, her voice trembling. But I wasn't buying it. "Please just let me explain." I wanted to scream. I wanted to yell at her, at John, at the entire situation. But I couldn't. Instead, I just stood there, frozen, a million thoughts running through my mind. How long had this been going on? What would my father think? And most importantly, how could she betray him like this? "Explain what, Mom?" I finally managed to say, my voice icy. "What exactly is there to explain?" John started to speak, but I cut him off with a glare. I couldn't even look at him without feeling sick. This man who had been like family to me had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And my mother, my own mother, had let it happen. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "It's just, your father and we've been distant for so long. I never meant for things to get this far." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was she really trying to justify this? Did she think her loneliness excused what she had done? I felt my world shattering around me, the solid foundation of trust I had always had in my family crumbling to dust. And John? I spat his name like it was poison. What about him? What does he have to say for himself? John, to his credit, didn't try to make excuses. He simply stood there looking guilty and ashamed, but somehow still arrogant. It made me hate him even more. "I made a mistake, Rachel," he said quietly. "A huge mistake. I care about your family, and I never meant to hurt anyone." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. A mistake? This wasn't a mistake. It was a betrayal of the deepest kind, and no amount of apologies could fix it. Without saying another word, I turned and walked out the door, leaving them both standing there in stunned silence. I couldn't deal with it. I needed time to think, to process everything I had just witnessed. How could my mother have done this to my father? How could John, someone I had trusted my whole life, have been part of it? I spent the next few hours driving around aimlessly, trying to wrap my head around the situation. I knew I couldn't keep this a secret from my father, but at the same time, I wasn't ready to destroy our family. I didn't want to be the one to rip everything apart. But how could I look my dad in the eye, knowing what I knew? My phone buzzed in the seat next to me, and I glanced down to see a text from my mom. "Please come home. We need to talk." I wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. But I couldn't avoid this forever. Eventually, I would have to face them both and decide what to do next. But as I pulled over to the side of the road, staring blankly out the window, one thing became painfully clear. Things would never be the same again. I stayed in the car for hours, the weight of what I had just uncovered pressing down on me like a heavy cloud. My mind was spinning, but I knew I couldn't stay out forever. Sooner or later, I'd have to go back home and face my mother. And John. I thought about what I should do next. Telling my dad seemed like the right thing to do, but I wasn't sure how to break such news without destroying him. My parents had built a life together. Years of shared memories, struggles, and love. I knew that what I had witnessed could shatter all of that. As the sun set, I finally worked up the courage to head home. When I walked through the door, my mom was sitting on the couch, her eyes red from crying. She looked up at me with a mixture of guilt and fear, but I had no sympathy to offer her. Not yet. "We need to talk," she whispered, her voice small and shaky. "Yeah, we do," I replied coldly, my emotions still a tangled mess. I sat down across from her, keeping my distance. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence was suffocating, but I wasn't about to break it first. Eventually, she took a deep breath and began. "I never wanted you to find out this way, Rachel. I never wanted you to find out at all." "That's comforting," I said sarcastically. "So you were just going to keep sneaking around behind Dad's back? How long has this been going on?" She winced at the harshness of my words, but didn't try to defend herself. "It's complicated. It started a few months ago. I never meant for it to turn into anything serious. I was just lonely, and John was there." "Lonely?" I repeated, disbelief and anger bubbling up inside me. "That's your excuse? You were lonely, so you turned to Dad's best friend? Do you have any idea what this is going to do to him?" Tears streamed down her face, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. "I know I've hurt you," she said, her voice cracking. "I know I've hurt your father, too. I don't know how to fix this." I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. "You can't fix this, Mom. You've broken something that can't be repaired." She sobbed quietly into her hands, but I didn't move to comfort her. I wasn't ready to forgive her. Not yet. Just as I was about to leave the room, the front door swung open and my father walked in. He smiled when he saw us, oblivious to the storm brewing in our living room. "Hey, girls," he said cheerfully. "What's going on?" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. This was the moment where everything came crashing down. My mother and I exchanged a look, both of us knowing there was no easy way out of this. "I need to talk to you," I blurted out, my voice trembling. "About something important." He looked concerned and set down his briefcase, sensing the tension in the room. "What is it? Is everything okay?" I hesitated. How could I possibly tell him? How could I shatter the trust he had in the two people he loved most? But before I could say anything, my mother stood up, wiping her tears. "I have something to tell you," she said softly, stepping forward. My dad's eyes shifted between us, confused. Carol, what's going on? He asked, his tone wary. I've made a terrible mistake, she whispered. Something I never thought I'd do. My dad frowned, but he still didn't understand. What are you talking about? She looked at him, her eyes full of regret and pain. It's about John. He and I, we crossed a line. The room fell into a deafening silence. My father's face turned pale as her words slowly sunk in. For a moment, it seemed like he hadn't heard her correctly. But then, the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. What did you just say? His voice was low, but there was an edge of disbelief that quickly turned to fury. I'm so sorry, my mother choked out, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean for this to happen. It was a mistake. A mistake? My father's voice rose, raw anger flashing in his eyes. You betrayed me with my best friend, and you call it a mistake? I could feel the tension in the air thickening, my father's devastation palpable. I had never seen him like this, so broken, so hurt. The man who had always been my rock looked as if his entire world had collapsed around him. How long? He demanded, his fists clenched at his sides. How long has this been going on? My mother sobbed uncontrollably, unable to speak. I couldn't stand to watch anymore, so I stepped in. Dad, I found out today, I said quietly, my voice shaking. It's been going on for a few months. He turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. I could see the pain in his eyes, but there was something else there too. Betrayal, confusion, and a deep aching sadness. The woman he had loved for decades had betrayed him, and so had the man he had called his best friend. I can't believe this, he muttered under his breath, running a hand through his hair. I never thought… Carol, how could you? I'm sorry, she cried. I never meant to hurt you. I just felt so alone. And you think that makes it okay? He shouted, his voice full of bitterness. You think that justifies this? I know it doesn't, she whispered, her tears falling faster. I've ruined everything. For a long time, none of us spoke. The silence was unbearable, the weight of what had just been revealed hanging over us like a dark cloud. My father stared at my mother, the woman he had trusted with his heart, and I could see the devastation written all over his face. I need to get out of here, he finally said, his voice hoarse. Without another word, he grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. My mother collapsed onto the couch, sobbing uncontrollably. I stood there, numb, unsure of what to do next. Everything I had known about my family, about the people I loved, had been torn apart in a matter of hours. I'm so sorry, Rachel, my mom whispered through her tears. I never wanted this to happen. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to comfort her, or if I even wanted to. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. As I sat down on the couch, staring at the door my father had just stormed through, I wondered how we would ever move forward from this.